Section 1. The show that refuses to give you all the answers. Get comfortable. Take a slow breath. Settle in wherever you are right now, because we are going to spend a long, long time together inside a show that was built deliberately and very intentionally to leave you sitting there in the quiet with questions that never fully resolve. Rick and Morty has been doing this since its very first episode, which aired on Adult Swim in December of 2013. From the very beginning, creators Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland understood something that most television writers either do not know or are too afraid to commit to. They understood that a mystery left unsolved, a thread left dangling just slightly out of reach, is infinitely more powerful than any answer you could ever provide. Because the moment you give the audience an answer, the question disappears. But when you give them a question without an answer, and then you just keep going, the question lives forever. It grows. It changes shape. It gets discussed in comment sections at 3 in the morning by people who cannot sleep, turning it over in their minds, pulling at every loose thread to see what unravels. The show is, on the surface, a science fiction comedy about a genius alcoholic grandfather named Rick Sanchez and his anxious, sweet, deeply unfortunate teenage grandson, Morty Smith, who lives with his mother Beth, his father Jerry, and his older sister Summer. Rick has built a portal gun that can punch holes in the fabric of reality itself, allowing travel to any dimension, any planet, any version of the universe that exists in an infinite multiverse. And every episode, to some degree, involves Rick dragging Morty somewhere impossibly dangerous and somehow getting them both back alive, at great cost to Morty's mental health and sense of self. But underneath that premise is something much more complicated, something layered, something that rewards the kind of patient, attentive watching that you do when you cannot sleep and you are going back through old episodes looking for details you missed the first time. Because this show is full of those details. It is full of moments that seem like throwaway gags or background jokes that turn out, seasons later, to be foundational to something enormous. The show has a habit of planting seeds in the soil of seemingly irrelevant episodes and then, years later, pulling up something that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. So tonight, or this morning, or whenever you are listening to this, we are going to go through all of it. Every major unsolved mystery. Every dangling question that the show has never fully answered. Every time paradox that bends the story back on itself in ways that should not be possible but somehow are. We are going to move slowly and carefully through the lore, the theories, the confirmed revelations, and the places where the show has deliberately chosen silence over explanation. There is a lot to get through. We will start at the very beginning of what makes this show's mythology tick, which is the identity of the man at the center of all of it. The man everyone calls Rick C-137, the smartest being in the universe? A character whose full story took 7 seasons to even partially tell, and whose mysteries are still not entirely resolved even now, heading into the show's 9th season, which premiered in May of 2026. This is a long one. Let that wash over you. Let the words come in slowly. You do not need to follow every thread actively. Some of this will settle into your mind on its own. And somewhere in the middle of the multiverse and the madness and the questions without answers, maybe you will find yourself drifting somewhere comfortable and quiet. Let us begin. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something wonderful about knowing that someone is listening to this from the other side of the planet at 4 in the morning, or curled up on a couch somewhere in a rainy afternoon. And if you are enjoying what we do here, a subscription means we can keep making these long, slow, detailed explorations of the things you love. Now, back to the multiverse. Section 2. Who is our Rick, actually? The identity question that haunted 7 seasons. Let the room be quiet for a moment while we think about this one. This seems like it should be the easiest question to answer. Rick Sanchez is the main character of the show. He is in the title. His name comes first. We have spent dozens upon dozens of episodes watching him build impossible machines, talk his way out of death, drink himself into a stupor, and somehow, impossibly, care about his family even as he does everything in his power to pretend he does not. Surely we know who he is, but here is where it gets complicated. And it gets complicated quickly, in a way that the show teased and hinted at, and then slowly, painstakingly confirmed over the course of years. When the series begins, Rick has just returned to the life of his daughter Beth after a long, unspecified absence. We do not know how long he was gone. We do not know exactly where he went. We do not know the circumstances under which he left in the first place, or why he chose to come back now. All we know is that he has arrived at the Smith family home, moved into the garage, and immediately begun involving Morty in dangerous interdimensional adventures. He is self-described as the smartest man in the universe. He has a portal gun. He is registered with the Galactic Federation as a known criminal. He is, by any measure, a force of chaos wrapped inside an old man who smells like alcohol. But the show drops hints, early and often, that the Rick we are following might not be exactly who he says he is. Or rather, that the story of how he got to be who he is runs deeper and darker than anyone initially suspects. The first major crack in the surface comes in a Season 1 episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, where we are introduced to the Citadel of Ricks, a massive floating city populated by thousands of alternate versions of Rick Sanchez pulled from across the multiverse. A council member, offhandedly, refers to our Rick as the most wanted criminal in the central finite curve, which is a phrase that means nothing at the time but will come to mean everything. Our Rick is, among the community of all possible Ricks, considered uniquely troublesome, a malcontent, the worst of them. And yet even that description gets more complicated the longer you watch. Then there is the Season 3 episode, The Rick Shank Redemption, in which Rick is captured by the Galactic Federation and interrogated using a device that lets them enter his memories. Inside his head, they find a memory of the moment he first became a scientist capable of building a portal gun. In this memory, another Rick visits him when he was young, before he had achieved anything, and offers him the secret to interdimensional travel. Our Rick refuses, and then the other Rick drops a bomb on his garage, killing his wife Diane and his daughter Beth. The memory ends. Our Rick, however, is laughing. He tells the agent that this was a totally fabricated backstory, a fake memory designed to trap them. He breaks free, uploads a virus into the Federation systems, and escapes. And when it is over, the audience is left genuinely unsure. Was that story true? Was it a lie? Did Rick even know what was real inside his own head? The answer is that it was mostly true, but the way it was presented, with Rick's denial, meant that the show chose to keep that backstory ambiguous for years. And while it was ambiguous, theories multiplied. People wondered whether the Beth who existed in the show was really Rick's biological daughter or a copy. People wondered whether the memories Rick suppressed were intentional or the result of something done to him. People went back and cataloged every time the show offered a hint about his past and tried to build a coherent timeline. Here is what the show eventually confirmed, piecemeal, across seasons 5, 6, and 7. Rick C-137. The Rick we follow was once a relatively ordinary scientist. He had a wife named Diane and a daughter named Beth, and they lived in a dimension designated C-137. He was working at that point on the problem of interdimensional travel, but had not cracked it. One day, an alternate version of himself, one who had already figured it out, visited him. This alternate Rick, who the show would come to call Rick Prime, offered C-137 the solution. Our Rick turned him down. He did not want to leave his family for a life of interdimensional adventure. He chose the people he loved over the infinite universe. Rick Prime, apparently insulted or perhaps just contemptuous, sent a bomb through a portal that killed Diane and Beth right there in the garage. He did this not to hurt C-137 specifically, at least not primarily. He did it because he had a philosophy. He believed that attachments were weaknesses. He believed that any Rick who chose family over the multiverse was wasting himself. He killed C-137's family to force him to evolve, to remove the anchors, to push him into becoming the kind of untethered, rootless, unstoppable genius that Rick Prime himself had already become. It worked, but not in the way Rick Prime intended. C-137, grieving and furious, threw himself into his work and cracked interdimensional travel on his own, becoming one of only 2 Ricks in all of existence to ever do it without being taught. He spent years hunting Rick Prime across the multiverse. He killed dozens of other Ricks in the search, looking for the one with the right DNA signature, the right history, the right profile. He never found him. Eventually, exhausted and worn down, he made a kind of peace with the other Ricks who had banded together, helped establish what would become the Council of Ricks and the Citadel, and then did something that seems on the surface completely contradictory to everything he is. He went to the dimension where Rick Prime had originally come from. He moved in with that dimension's version of Beth, who was still alive, who had never been killed, who had gone on to marry a man named Jerry Smith and have 2 children named Summer and Morty. He did this because he hoped Rick Prime would eventually come home. He figured the one place Prime would have to return to at some point was the dimension he started in. And when Prime came back, C-137 would be waiting. But something happened that he did not expect. He started to love them. Not right away, maybe not even consciously, but he stayed. He stayed long enough to watch Morty grow up, to take him on adventures, to build something that looked, from a distance, almost like a real family. And when the show begins, years later, Rick is still there, still waiting, still carrying the grief of Diane and Beth, still drinking to manage the weight of everything he cannot say. That is the man at the center of this story. And even after the show confirmed all of this across its later seasons, there are still questions that remain open. The most important one is this. Why did Rick Prime kill Diane and Beth? The most surface-level answer is ego. He was insulted. He could not tolerate a version of himself choosing connection over greatness. But the show hints that there was something calculated about it, something that went beyond a momentary insult. Rick Prime, as we eventually come to understand him, does not act on impulse. He plans. He thinks several moves ahead. So, was killing Diane and Beth really just reaction? Or was there a reason, a specific, deliberate reason, that Rick Prime needed C-137 to be unmoored? That question does not have a confirmed answer. It may never get one. But it sits at the center of everything, quiet and persistent, like a sound you cannot quite place. There is another dimension to the identity question that is worth sitting with, and it concerns the dimension designation itself. Rick calls himself Rick C-137. He has always called himself this. The Citadel accepts this designation. Other Ricks acknowledge it. But here is the thing. C-137 is not Rick's home dimension. C-137 is the dimension where Rick was born and where his Diane and Beth were killed. The dimension where our Rick and Morty currently live is not C-137. It is the prime dimension, or a version thereof, which Rick moved to after spending time hunting Rick Prime. When Rick and Morty moved to yet another dimension in Season 3, after the events of Rick Potion number 9, they take over lives that were not originally theirs. The Beth and Summer and Jerry they now live with are from a specific dimension that had its own Rick and Morty who died. Rick still calls himself Rick C-137. He applies his original designation to himself regardless of where he is physically located, because the designation refers not to the dimension he is currently in, but to the one he came from. This is philosophically interesting and practically confusing. The Citadel's dimensional registry presumably has records on Rick C-137 as an origin dimension, but if Rick has not been in C-137 for decades, and if C-137 itself was, as revealed in Season 6, stuck in a time loop of the day Rick lost his family, with its inhabitants aging while the rest of the world stayed frozen in a single moment, what does it mean to still identify with it? Rick C-137 is not Rick of the place called C-137 in any functional sense. He is Rick who was born in C-137. Rick who lost everything in C-137. Rick who carries C-137 in his name, the way some people carry a hometown they will never go back to in the way they describe themselves. In Season 6, Rick returns to C-137 when a portal fluid reset sends everyone back to their dimension of origin. What he finds there is the frozen ruin of the worst day of his life, stretched across decades, with people who aged while the world stood still, suffering quietly, waiting for an unfreezing that Rick eventually grants them by letting the time loop end. He destroys the AI version of Diane he had installed there to haunt himself. He says goodbye to the dimension he has been carrying in his name for all of this time, and then he leaves. After that, what does C-137 even mean to him? The designation stays. But the place it pointed to is gone in the only way that mattered, not physically destroyed but emptied of its meaning, its people released from a purgatory that Rick constructed from his own grief. He is still Rick C-137. The designation is a monument to loss that he refuses to put down. This is who we are watching at the center of this show. Not a nihilist who genuinely believes nothing matters. Not a genius who is too smart to be hurt. A man who has been carrying his worst day in his name for decades, using intelligence and alcohol and forward motion to avoid the moment he has to put it down and find out who he is without it. Section 3, Diane Sanchez and the Omega Device. The cruelest mystery confirmed. Here is something that most casual viewers of Rick and Morty never caught. Not because they were not paying attention, but because the show never drew a line between the details and asked you to connect them. It just placed the pieces on the board and waited. Across the multiverse of Rick and Morty, you see alternate versions of almost every member of the Smith family constantly. Beth in a dozen variations. Jerry in an infinite parade of mediocrity. Summer and Morty multiplied across every dimension. Even Rick has thousands of alternate selves, enough to populate an entire city. But in all of those dimensions, across all of that dimensional travel, in every moment the show spends inside alternate realities, you never see a version of Diane Sanchez. Not once. Not a single living alternate Diane, ever, anywhere. For years, the explanation most viewers assumed was simple. Diane died in the backstory. She was a figure from Rick's past, relevant emotionally but not cosmically. Of course, she did not appear in other dimensions. She was just gone. The writers probably did not want to build a complicated, recurring arc around a character who existed mostly as a motivating tragedy. Then Season 7 dropped the reveal in an episode called Unmortrican, which is also one of the most intense and emotionally brutal episodes the entire show has ever produced. During the climactic confrontation between Rick C-137 and Rick Prime, at the culmination of a vendetta that has been building across multiple seasons, Rick Prime reveals what he did after he killed Diane and Beth in C-137's dimension. He reveals the Omega Device. The Omega Device is a weapon of absolutely staggering horror, dressed up in very calm, almost bureaucratic language. It does one thing. It erases a person from every dimension simultaneously. Every version of them, in every universe that exists within reach of the multiverse, simply stops existing, not killed, erased, as if they were never there at all. Rick Prime used the Omega Device on Diane Sanchez. He erased her, all of her, from every dimension, from every reality inside the central finite curve. That is why there are no alternate Dianes. There are no versions of her living happily in other universes. There are no Dianes who never met Rick, or who divorced him, or who watched him leave and built a life of their own. She is simply not there, anywhere, because Rick Prime decided at some point, for his own reasons, that she needed to stop existing entirely across the whole of reality. The horror of this cannot be overstated, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it. Because this reveal reframes the entire emotional landscape of the show in one stroke, Rick has always been a man who lives with grief. That grief has been his defining interior feature from the very first episode, even when the show was still pretending it was just a silly adventure cartoon. The grief comes through in everything. In the drinking, in the cruelty that is really distance, in the way he keeps people close enough to need them but never lets them close enough to lose them again. We assumed that grief was for a woman who died in a bombing, which is already devastating. But now we understand something worse. Rick cannot grieve Diane the way people normally grieve someone. He cannot visit her grave in another dimension. He cannot find a version of her who survived. He cannot even encounter an echo of her in the multiverse, because the multiverse has been scrubbed clean of her presence by a man who decided she was an inconvenient attachment. What Rick Prime did to Diane is possibly the most genuinely malevolent act in the entire show. Not because of the scale of it, though the scale is cosmic, but because of the targeted, specific cruelty of it. Rick Prime did not just kill Diane. He killed the possibility of Diane. He killed every version of her that ever existed or could exist inside the reach of interdimensional travel. He made sure that Rick would never, in any dimension, ever run into someone who looked like her, sounded like her, reminded him of her in the way that might offer some small comfort. He took grief and then sealed every exit from it. And here is the part that the show confirms but does not dwell on, perhaps because dwelling on it too long would make it unbearable. Rick had access to a weapon capable of reversing this. The Omega Device, theoretically, could be used in reverse, or at minimum the schematics for it, acquired and studied by a genius of Rick's caliber, might point towards some possibility of restoration. In the episode's climax, Rick gets exactly one chance to either defeat Rick Prime or secure the Omega Device's plans for possible study. He chooses to kill Rick Prime. He does not take the plans. He lets Evil Morty escape with them. Whether that was the right choice is something the show does not adjudicate. Rick gets his revenge. He beats Rick Prime to death. The moment is cathartic and quiet and deeply sad all at once. But Diane is still gone, and the plans that might have led towards something are now in Evil Morty's hands, drifting somewhere beyond the central finite curve in a part of the multiverse that Rick cannot currently reach. Before we get to the remaining mystery, let's slow down and stay in the emotional reality of this for a moment, because the reveal about the Omega device is not just a lore fact. It is the answer to a question that had been sitting in the background of the show since almost the very beginning, generating low-level unease without ever being named. When you travel a multiverse with infinite dimensions, the assumption is that loss is never total. If you lose something in one dimension, that thing exists elsewhere. There are infinite versions of every person. If someone you love is gone from your universe, they are still somewhere. The multiverse, in this framework, is actually a comfort structure. Death becomes less permanent when infinite alternates still live. Grief becomes something you can navigate around rather than through. Rick's multiverse should have given him this comfort, and it did not, which means something prevented it. For years, the mystery was simply that Rick seemed to grieve Diane more deeply than the logic of the multiverse would seem to require. Most Ricks, losing a wife in one dimension, could simply go to another one and find a living version of her. Rick could build a portal gun to do exactly this. Why didn't he? Why did he spend decades hunting Rick Prime rather than simply going to a dimension where Diane never died? The Omega device answers this. He could not find a Diane in any dimension because there were no Dianes. Rick Prime, using a weapon of almost unimaginable scope, had systematically removed Diane Sanchez from all of existence, every version of her, from every universe within the central finite curve. The option was never available to Rick, not because of emotional prohibition or personal principles, but because the option had been literally eliminated. The multiverse could not offer him a replacement for Diane because the multiverse had been scrubbed clean of Dianes by the man he was chasing. This gives Rick's grief a texture that makes it uniquely terrible. He could not even find comfort in the way most people find comfort, by imagining that the person they lost is somehow still out there, in another form, in another life. Diane was completely and deliberately absent from every dimension he could access. Her presence had been made into an impossibility, not by nature, not by accident, by a specific deliberate act by a being who wanted to make sure Rick had nothing to return to. The mystery that remains is this. Rick chose closure over possibility. He chose to end the hunt over the chance to undo the worst thing that was ever done to him. Was that acceptance? Or was it exhaustion? Was it wisdom? Or was it the decision of a man so destroyed by decades of obsession that he could not imagine what came next if the obsession ended differently? And is Diane truly gone forever? The show has kept open the possibility, barely, that Evil Morty now holds the only key that might answer that question. But since Evil Morty's entire motivation has always been to be left alone, to be free of Rick entirely, handing that key back seems like the last thing he would willingly do. Section 4. Evil Morty. The most dangerous person in the multiverse, and where he came from. He first appears in a Season 1 episode, standing quietly in the background, wearing an eye patch, looking like nothing, like absolutely nothing. He is positioned as the sidekick of a character called Evil Rick, who has been murdering other Ricks across the multiverse and kidnapping dozens of Mortys for reasons the show takes its time revealing. Our Rick and Morty arrive to investigate. They get captured. The Citadel of Ricks frames our Rick for Evil Rick's crimes. There is a whole elaborate plot full of twists, and then, at the very end, the reveal. The Morty with the eye patch removes it. The wiring underneath blinks coldly. Evil Rick was not the one making the decisions. He was a puppet. The Morty was in control the whole time. And then Evil Morty simply walks into a crowd of liberated Mortys and vanishes. He is not apprehended. He is not confronted. He just disappears. What follows over the next several seasons is one of the most patient and brilliant long-form villain arcs in animated television. Evil Morty appears next in a Season 3 episode, this time running for president of the Citadel on a platform of Morty rights and Rick accountability. He wins. He immediately begins eliminating anyone who knows his real identity or could threaten his control. And then he governs with an iron grip that looks, from the outside, surprisingly reasonable, until you start noticing the bodies. Then comes the Season 5 finale. By now, Evil Morty has been consolidating power inside the Citadel for years. He has been using the Citadel's resources to research something that the show has been mentioning in passing since Season 1 without explaining: the central finite curve. In the finale's most striking scene, Evil Morty explains to our Morty what the curve actually is, in a speech that is visually stunning and thematically devastating. He explains that the universe Rick travels through is not the infinite multiverse. It is a curated section of it, specifically those universes where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive. The Ricks built a wall around their corner of infinity to make sure they could never accidentally arrive somewhere where they were not on top, where they were not special, where they were not the dominant life form by virtue of pure intelligence. Evil Morty uses the Citadel's technology to breach that wall. He opens a hole in the central finite curve and flies through it into the wider multiverse, into the universes outside Rick's curated cage, disappearing through a yellow portal into a part of reality that Rick's blue portals cannot currently reach. Then, in Season 7, we finally get the origin story. And it is both simpler and more resonant than most of the elaborate theories fans had built up over the years. Evil Morty was a regular Morty. That is where it starts. A regular Morty, presumably smart above average but still fundamentally a Morty, going on adventures with his Rick, enduring everything that comes with that. The fear, the danger, the constant low-grade humiliation of being treated as a sidekick, as a shield, as a tool, the feeling of having your worth measured only by how useful you are to someone else's genius, the knowledge that in the Citadel's cosmology, in the Rick and Morty relationship as it is institutionally defined, you are always the lesser half. You are always the one who exists in service. And one day, after one adventure too many, after one moment of Rick crossing a line he had crossed 100 times before, this particular Morty decided he was done. He got his Rick drunk. He implanted a cybernetic control device into his Rick while he was unconscious. He spent years building a plan, accumulating knowledge, murdering other Ricks to steal their memories and expertise, and setting in motion the elaborate scheme we saw in Season 1 that ended with him walking calmly away from the scene of his own crime. What makes this origin so affecting is not that it is dramatic or violent, it is that it is comprehensible. It is completely uncomfortably understandable. Every Morty watching this show has had moments where they looked at Rick and thought, there has to be a point at which this becomes too much. There has to be a limit. Evil Morty found his limit. Most Mortys absorb the damage, suppress the worst memories, and keep going. Evil Morty decided to stop absorbing and start building. There is something about Evil Morty's origin that the show asks you to sit with, and it is uncomfortable in a specific way that goes beyond the usual discomfort of watching a villain. When you watch the cold open of Unmortrican, the scene that reveals what pushed Evil Morty past the point of return, you are watching a scene that looks, from the outside, like dozens of scenes you have already seen. Rick pushing Morty too far. Rick dismissing Morty's feelings. Rick crossing the line between challenging his grandson and actually hurting him. It looks like an ordinary bad day between Rick and Morty. The kind of day the show has depicted many times. The difference is that this particular Morty had reached the boundary of what he could absorb. And the show is making an argument, quietly but clearly, that the boundary is the same for every Morty. It is just a matter of when and how you reach it. Our Morty has had his breaking points across the series. Moments where he snapped, where he pushed back, where he refused to go along with what Rick wanted. Moments where the cost of the adventures, measured in trauma and humiliation and genuine danger, finally surfaced as anger or grief or something approaching rebellion. Our Morty has not crossed the line that Evil Morty crossed. He has not built a device to take control of his Rick. He has not killed anyone. He has not constructed a plan for multiversal liberation. But the question the show is asking, and it is a question directed at the audience as much as at the characters, is this: how much further can it go? How many more adventures like the ones already depicted can Morty absorb before his breaking point is reached? And if his breaking point is somewhere ahead of him, what will it look like when he gets there? Evil Morty is our Morty's shadow. Not our Morty himself, but a version of the same person who was subjected to the same conditions and reached the same endpoint at some unspecified point in the future. The gap between them is not a fundamental difference of character. It is a gap of accumulated experience and the specific moment when enough became too much. The questions that remain about Evil Morty are substantial and likely to define the show's next several seasons. After escaping the central finite curve at the end of Season 5, he spent the time between that and his Season 7 reappearance trying to simply be left alone. He had gotten what he wanted. He was outside Rick's cage. He was free. All he wanted was for Rick to stop shaking the bars of the multiverse and bringing trouble to his doorstep. He helps Rick defeat Rick Prime in Season 7, partly for practical reasons and partly because of something that looks, briefly, like genuine feeling. He warns our Morty that Rick's obsession is a kind of poison. He seems to understand, better than almost anyone, how the cycle of fixation and revenge consumes people. And then he leaves again. And he takes the Omega device plans with him. The universe outside the central finite curve is unexplored territory for the show. We know Rick cannot currently reach it with his blue portals. Evil Morty is the only character confirmed to be operating in that space. He holds the plans for a weapon that could erase anyone from every dimension. He has intelligence comparable to Rick's. He has shown that he is capable of patience that extends across years, even decades. Is he done? Is he sitting somewhere in the wider multiverse, finally at peace, reading alien books in the quiet? Or is he building something? The show's 9th season, which premiered in May 2026, has not yet fully answered this. And the fact that the Season 8 finale showed the scientists surrounding Mr. Poopy Butthole are deeply alarmed by something his atomic structure reveals, connected to the wider multiverse, suggests that the world beyond the curve is not as quiet as Evil Morty might have hoped. Section 5. The Central Finite Curve. A prison built from pride. There is a line in the Season 5 finale that sounds like a philosophy textbook and lands like a gut punch. Evil Morty, explaining the central finite curve to our Morty, says something to this effect. The Ricks built a wall around infinity. They separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest man alive. Read that again slowly. The Ricks, collectively, looked out at an infinite neat-like multiverse. Infinite universes. Infinite variations of every possible reality, and decided to wall themselves off into the portion of it where they were always guaranteed to be on top. Not to protect themselves from anything external, not because the outer multiverse was dangerous, but because they could not tolerate the idea of going somewhere where a Jerry might be smarter than them, where a Rick might arrive and find himself just an average guy. The central finite curve is the most elegant expression of ego as architecture that modern fiction has produced. It is a whole structure built around one feeling: the need to always be the most impressive person in the room. The show first mentioned the curve in a throwaway line in Season 1. A Council of Ricks member refers to our Rick as the most wanted malcontent in the central finite curve. It is one sentence. No one watching could have predicted that this phrase would become one of the load-bearing concepts of the entire mythology, 41 episodes and 7 years later. The mechanics of the curve are worth understanding in detail because they change the meaning of everything the show has ever done. The portal gun, Rick's most iconic invention, does not actually open portals to any random universe in the multiverse. It opens portals within the curve. It operates inside the curated bubble. Every adventure Rick and Morty have ever gone on, every alien planet, every alternate dimension, every Citadel visit, every encounter with other Ricks and other Mortys, all of it happened inside this manufactured section of reality. Rick's whole life of exploration has been happening inside a cage of his own making. And here is the part that makes it specifically heartbreaking. Rick C-137 helped build the curve. In the early years after Diane's death, after the Citadel had been established and Rick had made a kind of peace with the Council of Ricks, he was involved in the design of the machine that would come to generate the curve. The official wiki describes it as a massive machine built underneath the Citadel, designed to lock out travel to any universe where Rick was not the dominant being. Rick helped build his own prison, not because he wanted to be imprisoned, but because at that point in his story, the curve probably felt like control, like the one thing he could guarantee. In a life where he had lost everything he loved, in a multiverse where anything could happen and frequently did, the curve was a promise. A promise that wherever he went, he would at minimum be the smartest person there. He would always have that. He eventually walked away from the Citadel and stopped participating in curve maintenance. But the infrastructure remained. The other Ricks maintained it, and Rick kept using portal fluid that was calibrated to the curve's parameters, which meant every portal he opened reinforced the system even as he pretended to be above it. The curve's destruction at Evil Morty's hands in the Season 5 finale is arguably the most significant structural event in the show's entire history. Not because it changes what the show looks like week to week, but because it removes the guarantee. Rick can now theoretically reach dimensions where he is not the smartest, where his portal gun is not the most advanced technology, where his genius is not the cosmic superpower it has always functioned as. The show has not fully explored this yet. Season 6 addressed it partially, with an episode establishing that someone quietly repaired the breach in the curve after Evil Morty punched through it, which frustrated Rick because he had been hoping to use that breach as a story arc. But the damage to the underlying concept has been done. Fans know what the curve is now, and knowing changes how you watch everything that came before it. The show uses the central finite curve to make a point about something very human, something that has nothing to do with science fiction at all. The Ricks built the curve because they could not tolerate uncertainty. They could not tolerate the possibility of arriving somewhere and not being the most important person there. The curve is a defense mechanism on a cosmic scale. It is the behavior of someone who is deeply afraid of irrelevance, disguised as an engineering project. And here is the part that the show takes pains to develop. Rick C-137, who is supposed to be the most emotionally complex and most individualized of all the Ricks, who explicitly rejects the Citadel and its institutionalized groupthink, helped build this thing. He helped engineer his own psychological comfort zone and then disguised it as infrastructure. He made his insecurity into a machine and then built a civilization inside it. The central finite curve is the most honest thing Rick ever built. Not because it represents his values, but because it represents his fears. It is a monument to the part of him that, despite everything, despite all the nihilism and the supposed indifference to outcomes, cannot stand the thought of being ordinary, cannot stand the idea that intelligence, which is the only thing he has had since the day his garage was bombed and his life was destroyed, might not be universally supreme. The destruction of the curve did not resolve this in Rick. It did not heal the fear. It just removed the safety net. And the question of how Rick C-137 functions in a universe where he is no longer automatically guaranteed to be the smartest person in the room is one of the most interesting open questions the show has set up for its future. Seasons. The remaining mystery of the curve is this. Evil Morty escaped through it. He is now in the outer multiverse. Rick has the ability to reach that space, demonstrated in Season 7 when he recalibrates his portal gun to track Rick Prime through the dimensional shockwaves. And the Omega device, which can erase people from all of reality, is now out there in that uncharted space with Evil Morty holding the schematics. What does a universe look like where Rick is not automatically the smartest person? What kind of powers operate there? And what was Rick Prime doing in all those years before we meet him in the present, operating in a multiverse he had explored far more thoroughly than our Rick ever did? These questions are threads the show has laid down carefully. They have not been pulled yet, but everything about the structure of the story suggests they will be. Section 6 Mr. Poopy Butthole. The smiling shadow nobody can explain. This section is about a small yellow creature in a top hat who says ooh-wee and once got shot in the living room. And it is one of the deepest, strangest, most persistently unanswered mysteries in the entire show. Mr. Poopy Butthole, now officially known as Professor Wayne Poopy Butthole in some contexts, first appeared in a Season 2 episode called Total Recall. In this episode, the Smith household is invaded by a species of alien parasites who reproduce by implanting false memories into people's minds. They make themselves seem like friends and family who have always been there, real people with real histories inside the memories of their hosts. The trap the family eventually figures out is this. Parasites can only create positive memories. They are not capable of implanting a bad memory of themselves. So, the family learns to check each apparent friend or family member by trying to remember a negative experience with them. Anyone you can only remember fondly is probably a parasite. Mr. Poopy Butthole is there when this starts happening. He is presented warmly as a longtime family friend. He appears in fabricated memories throughout the episode alongside the confirmed parasites, laughing with the family at holidays and gatherings. When the family begins hunting down and eliminating parasites, the logic of the episode seems to point inevitably toward Mr. Poopy Butthole being one of them. He is too cheerful, too consistently positive. Nobody has a bad memory of him. Beth, applying the episode's own logic, comes to the obvious conclusion. She shoots him, and then he bleeds, and he does not disappear the way parasites do when they die. He collapses. He is rushed to the hospital. He survives, but barely. He spends weeks recovering. He walks with a cane for a long time afterward. He was real. The show played a trick on the audience that it never really explained. It designed a character whose defining trait made him look exactly like one of the villains, and then confirmed he was not a villain, and then never told us what he actually was. Dan Harmon, in a 2017 interview, offered a theory, not a confirmation, just a theory that he personally found compelling. He suggested that Mr. Poopy Butthole might be a more advanced form of the same parasite species, one that has evolved or mutated into something that operates differently. Rather than creating positive memories wholesale, this evolved version finds the gaps that already exist in people's memories, the moments they do not quite remember clearly, the blank spaces, and inserts itself into those gaps. It does not manufacture a history. It slides into the spaces where a history could go. That is not confirmed canon. It is the co-creator speculating about his own character, which tells you something about the degree to which Mr. Poopy Butthole's nature was not fully planned from the beginning. He was created for an episode, turned out to be surprisingly beloved, and then the show kept finding reasons to bring him back without ever resolving the fundamental question of what he is and where he came from. The comics attempted an origin story, placing him on a home planet where he was a famous celebrity who gave up stardom for a quiet life on Earth with the Smiths. But the comics exist in a complicated canonical relationship with the show, and this backstory has never been confirmed or referenced in the main series. What the show has done is something more interesting and more unsettling. It has slowly built a tragedy around him. After being shot by Beth, Mr. Poopy Butthole goes through years of difficult recovery. The post-credit scenes across multiple season finales track his life in small, quiet moments. He gets a wife, he has a son, his life comes together and then starts to unravel. He loses his professorship in an episode where Rick essentially destroys his academic reputation as collateral damage in an elaborate heist scheme. He ends up homeless by the Season 7 finale. In desperation, he acquires a portal gun and travels to an alternate dimension where a version of himself is still living the life he lost, and he replaces that version of himself, essentially stealing his own alternate life, while the wife of his alternate self immediately suspects something is wrong. The Season 8 finale's post-credit scene makes this much worse. It reveals that Amy, his wife from this new dimension, has been investigating him. She has turned him over to scientists. And those scientists, examining his atomic structure, have confirmed that he does not match any dimensional signature in their database. His atomic vibrations do not correspond to anything within the known multiverse. They specifically use the word reality rather than universe, which is a distinction the show has not clarified, but which fans have interpreted as suggesting Mr. Poopy Butthole may have originated from somewhere completely outside the central finite curve, somewhere in the wider multiverse that was previously inaccessible. If that is true, it raises a question that makes everything about his presence in the show feel suddenly enormous. If Mr. Poopy Butthole came from beyond the curve, how did he get inside it? What does he know about the outer multiverse? Is his relentless warmth and positivity a genuine personality trait, or the expression of something else? Something we have not been given the information to interpret correctly yet. The Season 9 premiere on Adult Swim is currently airing at the time this script is being written, and the show has not yet fully confirmed whether Mr. Poopy Butthole will be developed into a major antagonist or resolved in some other direction. But the narrative infrastructure is in place, and the fact that he has been quietly present for nearly every season, always warm, always breaking the fourth wall, always looking directly at the camera and talking to us, the audience, with apparent full awareness that we are watching him on a screen, makes him feel like a character who has always known more than he was letting on. Before we get to the audience theory, let's spend a moment on Dan Harmon's own suggestion, because it is stranger and more interesting than it first appears. He proposes that Mr. Poopy Butthole is a being who exists in a relationship with memory, the way a hermit crab exists in a relationship with shells. He does not create false memories. He inhabits the natural gaps, the blank spaces, the moments people do not quite remember clearly. He slides into the uncertain edges of recollection and makes himself at home there. If this is true, it means Mr. Poopy Butthole's entire existence is parasitic in structure, but not in intent. He is not creating harm. He is not inserting traumatic or manipulative content. He is simply filling in the blanks, making himself part of a history that already had space for him. He belongs to the family not because he forced himself into their memories, but because their memories had room for him, and he is advanced enough or different enough from the standard parasite species to sense and exploit that space without doing damage. This makes his shooting by Beth even darker in retrospect. Beth's logic was correct given the information she had. The parasite test was sound. She found no bad memories involving him and concluded he was a threat. But the absence of bad memories was not because he was fabricating positive ones. It was because he never actually created a bad memory. He has been genuinely, consistently, with the test failed not because he cheated it, but because it was not designed to account for the possibility of a being who genuinely had no bad history to leave behind. He was shot for being exactly what he appeared to be, for being real. There is one fan theory that is worth including here because it reframes the whole character in a way that is genuinely eerie. The theory proposes that Mr. Poopy Butthole represents us, the audience, that his fourth wall breaks are not a quirk, but the show's way of acknowledging that there is a category of being who exists in the world of the show, but whose presence has never been explained by the show's internal logic. We have always been there. We have always been friendly to the Smiths. Beth has no bad memories of us, because from our position outside the screen, we have never actually hurt anyone. And Mr. Poopy Butthole, as a being whose atomic structure does not match any known dimensional signature, might be the show's personification of the audience itself, inserted into the narrative, present but unexplainable. That theory is obviously not literally true, but it captures something real about why this character is so persistent and so strange. He is there, he has always been there, and we do not know why. Section 7. The Talking Cat. The one secret Rick did not want to know. Season 4, Episode 4. Claw and Hoarder. Special Ricktims Morty. There is a subplot in this episode that has nothing to do with the main story about Morty and a dragon. It follows Jerry, who discovers a talking cat in his bedroom. The cat is voiced by Matthew Broderick. It is a pleasant, charming gray tabby that speaks perfect English and has exactly one philosophy. Do not ask questions, just have fun. The cat refuses to explain itself. When Jerry asks why it can talk, it brushes him off. When Jerry asks where it came from, it deflects. Its entire approach to every question about its own nature is some variation of why would you need to know that, let's just go to Florida and have fun. They go to Florida. The cat has fun. Things go sideways in the way things tend to go sideways around the Smith family. Eventually Rick gets involved, as Rick inevitably does, and he decides to do what Rick does when faced with something anomalous. He examines it scientifically. He traps the cat inside an energy containment field, and he builds a device that allows him and Jerry to peer directly into the cat's memories, into its mind. What Rick and Jerry see is never shown to the audience. The show presents it from the outside. We hear screaming, we see Rick and Jerry's faces through the goggles, and we watch their expressions change. Jerry starts to cry. He mentions his parents' photo on the mantelpiece. Rick, who has survived horrors that would end most beings, briefly considers suicide. Then he erases Jerry's memories of the whole event and lets the cat go. The cat, relieved, wanders off into the desert. It encounters the dragon from the episode's main storyline, and the two of them head toward Florida together, the cat asking how fast the dragon can fly them there. That is it. The show never revisits the talking cat. There is no follow-up episode, no revelation, no callback. Just the memory of Rick and Jerry looking at something through a pair of goggles and being fundamentally altered by what they saw. Dan Harmon has addressed this. In an interview with Decider, he said that the talking cat was originally a joke about the creative process. It represents the voice in a writer's room that says, "Stop overthinking it and just have fun." The cat literally says this throughout the episode. Do not ask why, just enjoy it. Harmon called it a commentary on how the show sometimes feels pressure to explain and justify everything, and how occasionally the right answer is to just let something exist without a reason. But then Harmon also said something else. He said that they discussed various possible answers for what Rick and Jerry saw, and they realized collectively that any specific answer they could write would be less frightening, less affecting, than what the audience was imagining on their own. The gap between the reaction we see from Rick and Jerry and the unknown nature of its cause is where the horror lives. Fill in the gap and the horror collapses. So they made a deliberate choice. The cat's secret would stay a secret, not because they could not think of an answer, but because they understood that the audience's own imagination would produce a better answer than they could. The fan theories are extensive and wonderfully diverse. Some people believe the cat committed unspeakable acts against other beings in its home dimension. Some believe it knows something about the nature of reality itself, something that causes people to question the meaning of existence when confronted with it directly. One particularly popular theory connects the cat to H.P. Lovecraft's The Cats of Ulthar, a short story about sentient cats who commit terrible violence. Another theory suggests the cat's secret is connected specifically to Beth, the one person both Rick and Jerry have enough in common to react to emotionally. If the cat did something to Beth, or was planning something involving her, that would give both men sufficient reason for their extreme reactions. A third theory, which is wilder, proposes that the cat's mind showed Rick and Jerry something about the constructed nature of their reality, a confirmation that they exist inside a cartoon on a television screen, which would certainly account for the suicidal ideation. The cat remains unexplained. It likely always will. And that is, as frustrating as it sounds, probably the right call. But let us dwell in the specific details of what we did see for a moment, because even the visible parts of this mystery contain something worth sitting with. Jerry vomits and cries and mentions his parents' photo on the mantle. Rick briefly considers suicide. These are not equivalent reactions. Jerry's reaction is visceral disgust and grief and disorientation. The reaction of someone confronted with something that violates their understanding of the world in a personal way. Rick's is something darker, more abstract, closer to existential collapse. Rick, who has faced the destruction of entire dimensions, who has stared into the void of infinite meaninglessness and mostly shrugged at it, who has dealt with creatures and entities of genuine cosmic horror, watches a cat's memories and for a moment does not want to continue existing. Whatever is in that cat's mind, it crossed a threshold that universe-ending threats and dimension-hopping consequences have never crossed. It reached something in Rick that his armor does not normally protect. And the fact that it also reached Jerry, who is in almost every other respect the opposite of Rick in terms of emotional resilience and philosophical depth, suggests that what they saw was not something that required sophistication or intelligence to be destroyed by. It was something that hit human beings at the level of something so fundamental that the gap between Rick and Jerry collapses in front of it. The erasing of Jerry's memories at the end is also worth noting. Rick erases his own family members' memories on a fairly regular basis in this show, usually to avoid consequences or to protect operational security. But he erases Jerry's memory of the cat's secret specifically, not to protect himself, not for any practical strategic reason, but seemingly because he cannot allow Jerry, the most emotionally unguarded and psychologically fragile member of the household, to walk around with whatever that knowledge is living inside him. That is a small, quiet act of protection from Rick toward Jerry. A recognition that what they saw was something a person should not have to carry. And Rick, who normally treats Jerry with thinly veiled contempt, decides to spare him from it. That single detail might be the most telling thing in the entire subplot. Whatever the cat's secret is, Rick considered it merciful to erase it from the memory of a man he does not particularly respect. Section 8 Morty's existence is a time paradox, and he doesn't know it. Now we are getting into the part of this that genuinely bends when you look at it directly. Rick and Morty has an interesting relationship with time travel. The creators established early on that they wanted to avoid it. Dan Harmon has spoken about how time travel stories tend to collapse under their own internal logic, creating paradoxes and plot holes that take over the story and make everything feel messy and unresolvable. So, for the first several seasons, time travel was explicitly shelved, literally. There is a box on a shelf in Rick's garage labeled time travel stuff, and it just sits there, a visual acknowledgement that the option exists and is being deliberately left alone. But here is what is fascinating. The show managed to create a time paradox at the center of its own mythology without ever deploying a traditional time travel story. The paradox is not something that happens in an episode. It is the condition that makes the show possible at all. The Rick and Morty comic series, published by Oni Press, contains an issue called The Flesh Curtains, which explores Rick's early life before the events of the main series. In this issue, a young Rick is performing with a band, playing music rather than conducting science. Their performances are failing. Their patron, who funded the band and is not pleased about the returns on his investment, threatens to have them all killed. Things are looking genuinely terminal. What saves them is vomit, specifically, Morty's vomit. At the moment of crisis, Morty, watching through what turns out to be a wormhole rather than a recording, accidentally causes vomit to fall through the wormhole onto the men threatening the band. The confusion and chaos that follows allows the band to escape. Rick and his associates survive. He has an experience that crystallizes something for him. He realizes he wants a family. He wants a grandson someday. That grandson turns out to be Morty. But here's the problem. Morty only existed because Rick survived. Rick only survived because Morty caused a distraction. Morty could only have been there to cause that distraction because he was already born. And he was only born because Rick survived. Neither event can logically come first. Each one requires the other to have already happened. Morty's existence is built on a foundation that should not be able to support itself. He is the cause of the conditions that allowed his own existence. He is, in the most precise sense of the word, a paradox. Now, Rick and Morty is a show that operates in a multiverse with infinite parallel timelines, so you could argue that some other version of events allowed Rick to survive in most alternate realities without Morty's intervention, and the specific timeline where Morty's vomit was the deciding factor is just one possible branch. But if that is the case, then our specific Morty, the one in our timeline, is genuinely only alive because of something he did before he was born. The show's relationship with this kind of bootstrap paradox, where a cause and an effect become circular and each requires the other to have preceded it, runs throughout its engagement with time travel, whenever time travel does come up. The Snake episode, Rattlestar Ricklactica, which we will get into shortly, builds an entire plot around this structure. Rick and Morty's involvement in the Snake's timeline is required because of events that Rick and Morty's involvement causes. The information they need to give the Snakes in the past, they can only know because they received it from their own future selves. No one is the original source of the knowledge. It circulates endlessly. The show does not take these paradoxes seriously in the way that hard science fiction tends to. It uses them playfully, as set pieces, as sources of absurd comedy. But the fact that Morty himself is a walking bootstrap paradox is not played for comedy in the comic at all. It is presented quietly, almost elegantly. It is the show's way of saying that the premise of Rick and Morty is not just structurally weird. It is causally impossible, and yet here it is. The bootstrap paradox has a name in philosophy and theoretical physics. It refers to any causal loop in which an effect becomes its own cause, where a sequence of events is self-sustaining and has no point of origin outside the loop. The term comes from the expression pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, which describes the physical impossibility of lifting yourself using only your own strength with no external support. The information, object, or event in a bootstrap paradox has no origin outside the loop. It exists only because it exists. Morty's existence, if the comic is taken as valid, is precisely this. He exists because he intervened to save Rick before he was born. He was able to intervene because he already existed. There is no version of this chain of events that can be placed in linear order without creating a contradiction. The sequence requires both ends to already exist before either of them can begin. What this means for how we understand Morty is profound and strange. It suggests that Morty is not simply the product of the Smith family's history unfolding in a linear, causal way. His existence has a flavor of predetermination to it, a sense in which the universe, or at least the specific timeline that contains this story, required him to exist in order to function. He is not here by accident. He is not here simply because his parents fell in love. He is here because the universe needed him to be here so that Rick would be alive to have a grandson. Rick, who claims to believe in nothing, who claims the universe is indifferent and existence is meaningless, is alive because his grandson saved him. His grandson's existence is predicated on Rick having survived to become a grandfather. They are woven together not just emotionally but causally, at the foundation of reality itself. The nihilism Rick performs, the claim that connections are arbitrary and love is just chemistry, sits uneasily against this structural fact. The universe, or at least the specific corner of it they inhabit, is built around the two of them needing each other in the most literal possible sense. Rick probably knows this. The show has not confirmed it. But Rick, who knows more about the structure of reality than almost any other being, who has clearly accessed enough temporal information across his career to understand how causality works at the edge cases, almost certainly knows that his existence and Morty's existence are intertwined in a way that is not ordinary. And the drinking, the nihilism, the constant theatrical performance of not caring, might look very different if you understand it as the behavior of a man who is terrified of needing someone he already knows is structurally required for his own existence. Section 9. A Wrinkle in Time. When reality forked and nobody could touch each other. This is the episode that most thoroughly breaks the show's own internal logic and commits to that breaking with absolute dedication. Season 2, Episode 1. A Wrinkle in Time. Here is the setup. At the end of Season 1, Rick froze time during a family party so that the mess from the party could be cleaned up without anyone noticing. The Smiths existed in a frozen moment, outside of normal time, for what was the equivalent of 6 months. The show picks up in Season 2 with Rick preparing to unfreeze time. The problem is that when you freeze time and then live inside the frozen period, you create a situation where causality has been interrupted. Events that were supposed to flow from one another no longer connect properly because the interruption inserted a whole stretch of lived experience into a gap that was meant to contain zero duration. When Rick unfreezes time, the uncertainty created by that gap causes reality itself to become unstable. The solution Rick devises involves a set of time collars worn by Rick, Morty, and Summer, which are supposed to keep them synchronized as time restabilizes. The collars work by keeping the three of them in agreement with each other. As long as their timelines remain synchronized, reality holds together. But the moment any of them acts or thinks differently from the others, time begins to fork. And that is exactly what happens. Morty and Summer disagree about something. Time forks. Now there are two simultaneous versions of reality happening at once. A version where Morty's decision won out and a version where Summer's did. Rick has to navigate both, which means Rick also splits. Now there are two Ricks. The two Mortys and the two Summers keep disagreeing, and the forks keep multiplying until there are dozens of versions of reality simultaneously happening in the same space, all of them requiring coordination to merge back into one. The visual comedy of the episode is extraordinary. All these duplicate characters have to make the same gestures at the same time in parallel, have to be in the same positions, have to essentially agree at the moment of unification, or the timelines collapse further. A fourth-dimensional being shows up to arrest Rick for abusing time, which introduces a whole new complication. Rick beats him up and sends him spinning backward through time to a different era, which creates its own cascade of consequences visible in a brief mid-credits scene. The time paradox embedded in this episode is layered. When reality forks, which of the forks is real? The show presents both as equally valid, equally physical, equally inhabited by real people. But ultimately only one version persists when they are finally merged. What happened to the people in the version that did not survive the merge? Were they absorbed into the survivors? Were they erased? The episode does not say. This connects to a broader question about the show's approach to alternate dimensions. Rick and Morty are established in a crucially dark Season 1 storyline to have already abandoned one version of themselves. In Rick Potion number 9, Rick's love potion goes catastrophically wrong, and the population of Earth is transformed into grotesque monster hybrids called Cronenbergs. Rick cannot fix it. Instead, he opens a portal to a dimension where an alternate Rick and Morty have just died in an unrelated accident. He and Morty assume those dead versions' lives, moving into their home, being greeted by their families, and burying their own dead bodies in the backyard. This is presented as Rick's contingency plan. His ability to simply switch to a fresh universe when one becomes unusable. It is practical and it is devastating, and it raises a question that the show treats lightly, but which is, if you think about it for more than a moment, genuinely horrifying. The Beth and Jerry and Summer who have been in every episode since that one are not the original Beth and Jerry and Summer from Rick's home dimension. They are replacements. Or rather, they are a Beth and Jerry and Summer whose original Rick and Morty died, who have been unknowingly living with imposter versions of their family members ever since. They do not know this. Rick and Morty know, and they carry it. This is a form of grief that has no social language. When you lose a person, there are rituals, there are funerals and memorials, and the shared acknowledgement of a community that a loss occurred. When Rick and Morty abandoned their original timeline at the end of Rick Potion number 9, there was no ritual. There was just a shovel and a backyard and two people burying their own bodies while their replacement's family watched TV inside the house. Morty has an episode, in Season 3, where we see that he has been using a device to erase traumatic memories. He has been doing it compulsively, regularly, because the number and severity of traumatic things that have happened to him during his adventures with Rick have accumulated past the point where any human being could continue functioning normally with all of them intact. He has essentially been deleting chunks of himself to remain operational. Some of those deleted chunks presumably include memories of the original timeline, the original home, the original family. Whatever grief he felt about leaving them was likely one of the first things he erased. But erasing a memory does not erase its effects. The body keeps score. The choices a person makes after a trauma are shaped by that trauma, even when the explicit memory of it is gone. Morty's deep anxiety, his need to be needed, his fear of being abandoned or replaced, these could all be the echoes of a loss he no longer consciously remembers making. The A Wrinkle in Time episode, for all its visual comedy and structural experimentation, is really about this same theme. When time forks and there are suddenly two Mortys, two Summers, two Ricks, the question underneath the chaos is the same one that has been running through the show since Rick Potion number 9. Which one is the real one? If they are identical in every respect, both having the same memories, same feelings, same reactions, what makes one more legitimate than the other? And when they merge, what happened to the version that was absorbed? The show does not answer this. The characters do not ask it. The episode moves too fast and is too funny to pause for that kind of introspection. But the question is there, humming in the background, consistent with everything the show keeps returning to. Identity is not fixed. The self is not a stable object. You can be duplicated, merged, edited, replaced, and the world keeps moving as if none of that matters, as if whoever you are right now is who you have always been. Section 10. Rattlestar Rick Lactica and the Snake Ouroboros. The Snake episode is one of the most purely enjoyable pieces of time paradox comedy in the show's entire run. It is also one of the episodes that most directly examines the self-defeating nature of time travel as a solution to problems, and it does this by taking the most ridiculous possible scenario and following its internal logic to its most absurd possible conclusion with complete commitment. Morty in space during the cold open encounters a snake astronaut, a space snake. A snake who has evolved on another planet, developed technology and spaceflight, and become the first member of her species to reach the stars. She approaches Morty. Then she bites him, because she is still a snake and biting is what snakes do when they encounter something new. The bite is venomous and nearly fatal. The snake then inadvertently gets killed herself. Morty, feeling guilty, replaces her with a snake from Earth. A regular, non-sentient Earth snake. He returns this Earth snake to the snake planet as a replacement. And this action immediately destroys the snake civilization's timeline in ways that ripple outward for decades in snake time. Here is the cascade. The Earth snake introduced to the snake planet becomes significant to snake culture somehow. Its presence changes things. Snakes who were supposed to meet and form partnerships do not, or do, meet and do. Different scientific breakthroughs happen in different orders. The snake equivalent of the entire 20th century unfolds differently because of this Earth snake's presence in the gene pool and in the cultural memory of the snake people. Eventually, the snakes develop time travel. And because of the specific way snake history unfolded differently than it would have without the Earth snake's influence, the first thing the snakes do with time travel is send mechanical robot snakes back in time to kill Morty, who they identify as the cause of their timeline's divergence. Simultaneously, a snake resistance movement sends a robot snake back to protect Morty. Both arrive at the Smith household. Chaos ensues. This forces Rick and Morty to go to the snake planet, enter its history, and give the snakes time travel earlier than they would have naturally developed it, so that the time cops, the fourth-dimensional beings who police temporal anomalies, will notice the disruption and intervene to clean everything up. But to give the snakes time travel in the snake equivalent of 1985, Rick and Morty have to already know how to give snakes time travel, which they only know because they are living in a timeline where they already went back and did it. There is no point in this causal chain where someone is the first to do it. The information about how to give snakes time travel circulates endlessly through a loop. Rick and Morty know it because they go back. They go back because they know it. Neither can be prior to the other. The show resolves this with the intervention of the time cops, who go back to before any of this started and kill the very first snake who ever used a tool, eliminating the snake's entire evolutionary path towards sentience before it can begin. The snake civilization simply stops having ever existed. All the time-traveling snakes disappear. The problem solves itself by eliminating its own origin, which is, when you think about it, its own paradox. If the snakes never existed to invent time travel, the time cops would have had no reason to go back and stop them from developing. But the show correctly identifies that following this to its logical end would consume the episode entirely in meta-reasoning, so it simply ends there. The time cops did it, done. Moving on. The wisdom embedded in this choice is the same wisdom that made the creators want to avoid time travel in the first place. The moment you start following the logic of these loops, you end up eating yourself like the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake biting its own tail. You cannot get to a starting point. There is no starting point. There is only the circle. Section 11. Jessica and the Time Gods, the girlfriend who accidentally became eternal. Here is a character whose story arc in the show began as a simple crush subplot and ended in something genuinely cosmic and deeply strange. Jessica is Morty's classmate and lifelong object of affection. For most of the show, she exists primarily as the embodiment of normal, earthbound desire. The thing Morty wants but cannot have. The reason he occasionally wants to stay home instead of going on interdimensional adventures. She is a grounding presence, a representative of ordinary teenage life, and a reminder that under all the dimension hopping, Morty is just a 14-year-old kid with a crush. Then, in a Season 4 episode called Never Rick and Morty, she becomes a time god, sort of. The episode is structured as an anthology wrapped inside a frame story involving a cursed train that forces the characters into increasingly self-referential narrative loops. It is one of the most formally experimental episodes the show has done. In it, there is a sequence involving Jessica that plays with the idea of infinite time experiencing, where she is exposed to something called the time crystal, or a similar mechanism that causes her to experience all of time simultaneously. The more explicitly canonical version of this happens in a Season 4 episode involving the Bovians, an alien species who submerge Jessica in a substance that crystallizes and traps her, and from within that crystallized state she begins to perceive all of time at once. She experiences every moment in every direction simultaneously. She is, functionally, suspended outside of linear time, experiencing eternity as a single moment. When she eventually breaks free or is freed, she is changed. She describes having seen everything, and the episode ends with her walking home and announcing, in a moment that is both funny and slightly haunting, that she is a time god now. And then she goes home. Normal teenage home, normal suburban street, and the show moves on without her. Fans have been waiting since this moment for the Jessica time god thread to go somewhere. It has not been developed in any substantial way through the show's 8th season. Jessica remains on the margins, occasionally visible in crowd scenes at school, but the enormous cosmic thing that happened to her has not been brought back as a plot point. This is one of those places where the show's tension between its episodic impulses and its serialized ones is most visible. The Jessica time god moment was extraordinary. It transformed a supporting character into something with potentially universe-altering significance. A person who has experienced all of time simultaneously is, by definition, one of the most powerful and informed beings in existence. She should have access to information that changes the entire game. But the show made a choice, or perhaps fell into a pattern, where the episodic episodes keep resetting everyone to their baseline. Jessica goes home. She goes back to school. The time god thing sits in her background like a fact about her that just has not been brought up recently. The theory that seems most compelling to longtime fans is that Jessica's time god status is being saved for a moment when the stakes are highest. The central finite curve has been breached. Evil Morty is loose in the wider multiverse with the Omega device plans. Mr. Poopy Butthole's nature has been flagged as something outside known dimensional parameters. A being who has experienced all of time simultaneously might be exactly the right character to surface in that moment with information that changes everything. A seemingly inconsequential subplot from Season 4 becoming the answer to a problem in Season 9 or 10 is exactly the kind of long, patient storytelling that Rick and Morty does at its best. Or, it might just have been a funny gag. The show is comfortable letting you decide. But let's stay with the Jessica mystery a little longer, because even if the time god thread turns out to be a one-episode joke that never gets developed, what it did to Jessica as a character in that moment is worth examining. For most of the show, Jessica is the embodiment of ordinary earthbound human normalcy. She is the reason Morty sometimes says no to Rick. She is the anchor to the real world, to the high school, to the teenager-shaped existence that is constantly being overridden by the adventures. She does not know what Morty has seen or survived. She just knows him as a slightly awkward kid in her class who seems more interesting than he lets on. Then she is submerged in an alien substance and comes out the other side, having experienced all of eternity simultaneously. And the first thing she does, after walking home in a daze, is announce her new status with a kind of exhausted certainty and go back to her normal life. As if you could experience infinite time and then just have dinner. What is she experiencing, right now, in every scene where she appears as a background character? She has seen all of time. She has presumably seen every adventure Rick and Morty have ever gone on. She has presumably seen herself, seen this moment, seen all the moments that follow. She knows how this ends, presumably, because she has been suspended in the experience of knowing everything at once. Does she know what the talking cat did? Does she know what Mr. Poopy Butthole is? Does she know where Evil Morty went and what he is building? Does she know what Rick's future looks like past the death of Rick Prime? A Jessica who has experienced all of time and then returned to her normal high school life is either the most devastated or the most zen being in the show's entire cast. Either she is trapped in the awareness of everything and simply continuing to function because the only alternative is not functioning, or she has achieved a kind of acceptance that comes from having seen all possible outcomes and understanding that the journey through them is the point rather than any specific destination. Either version of Jessica is more interesting than the show has so far had time to develop. The question of what she knows and whether she will ever use or share that knowledge is one of the most intriguing, unexplored threads the show possesses. Section 12, the Beth clone problem. Which one is real, and does it matter? This one is almost more of a philosophical question than a mystery, but the show uses it to examine something genuinely interesting about identity, memory, and what makes a person who they are. In a Season 3 episode called The ABCs of Beth, Rick offers Beth a remarkable choice. He tells her that he can create a perfect clone of her, an absolutely identical copy right down to every memory and personality trait, and this clone can stay behind to live Beth's life, while the real Beth goes out into the universe and has adventures, explores, becomes the version of herself she might have been if she had not gotten pregnant in high school and settled into a suburban horse surgeon career. Beth accepts. Or she does not. The show deliberately does not tell us. The episode ends with Beth making a decision that we do not see, and Rick telling her that whatever she decided is the right call. In subsequent seasons, we see Beth apparently living her normal life, and we also see Space Beth, a version of Beth who is out adventuring across the universe with advanced combat skills, and a very different energy from the Beth we know. The show confirmed that there are two Beths and that neither Rick nor the Smiths know which one is the original. Rick says explicitly that he does not know, that he designed the process to be indistinguishable even to himself. The uncertainty is the point. Space Beth and Home Beth are both real. Both are Beth Sanchez. Both have equal claim to the identity and the history and the relationships. The original versus the copy distinction stops meaning anything when the copy is perfect down to the quantum level. But the mystery that persists is not which one is real. It is which one Beth chose to be. Did the original Beth choose to stay home, concluding that her family and her ordinary life were what she actually wanted? Or did she choose adventure, stepping through into a wider universe? And the Beth currently living with Jerry and Morty is a copy who does not know she is a copy. The show's Season 8 focused significantly on Beth's character, giving her more psychological depth and exploring her relationship with both her father and her own sense of self. The final episode of Season 8 dealt with Memory Rick and Memory Diane, Rick's AI reconstructions of his lost family, and the emotional devastation of Rick having to let go of that version of Diane he had built in his grief. But the Beth clone question was not definitively resolved. Space Beth exists. Home Beth exists. They have met, they have fought each other. They have had moments of genuine connection. The show treats them both as equally real, which is, in the context of a show about infinite alternate dimensions, where multiple versions of everyone already coexist, the only honest position to take. The question of which Beth is the original may simply never be answered. And the show's implicit argument is that it should not matter. The person you are is made of your experiences from this moment forward, not from the circumstances of your origin. Both Beths have equal access to the Smith family history. Both Beths feel the same love for Morty and Summer. Both Beths are equally confused about their feelings toward Rick. Which one is the real Beth? The real Beth is both of them. The real Beth is whoever Beth is choosing to be right now. But this answer, while philosophically satisfying, is practically painful, because the Beth at home with Jerry and the kids and the horse surgery career, whether she is the original or the copy, has to live with the knowledge that there is another version of herself out there doing all the things she either chose not to do or never got to choose. Every adventure Space Beth goes on is an adventure Home Beth is watching from the outside, either as the original who chose this life and sometimes wonders about the other, or as a copy who was built to feel like she chose this life and has to navigate the strange vertigo of knowing her deepest feelings might have been constructed rather than grown. Space Beth, meanwhile, is living the life that Beth imagined wanting, exploring, adventuring, not tethered to a house in the suburbs, but everything she achieves, every connection she forms, every version of herself she builds out in the universe, she builds it knowing there is another version of her at home who either gave this up willingly or never had it to begin with. Both states carry their own specific sadness. The show has used this plotline to ask a genuine philosophical question about identity and choice. If you are given the freedom to become whoever you want to be, is the version of yourself that chooses freedom actually more authentic than the version that chose responsibility? Or are both choices equally valid expressions of who you are, and the freedom to choose between them is what matters rather than which choice you make? Beth, in the context of the show's mythology, is doubly interesting as a character because her daddy issues, her need for Rick's approval and attention, mean that any choice she makes about her own life is already complicated by the question of what Rick would think. Rick enabled the clone option specifically. He built the machinery. He gave her the ability to go. Whatever Beth chose, Rick's presence in that choice is inescapable. Even her escape from her ordinary life, if that is what she chose, was enabled by her father. Even her decision to stay, if that is what she chose, exists in the context of a father who gave her permission to leave. Neither version of Beth is free of Rick, which might be the most honest thing the show has ever said about that relationship. Section 13. The Citadel and the Question of Rick Plurality. Here is a paradox that lives inside the architecture of the show itself, and that the show has never fully reconciled. The Citadel of Ricks is a city built by and populated by thousands of alternate versions of Rick Sanchez from across the multiverse. But here is the problem. Rick C-137 helped build the Citadel. He was there at its founding. He knows its secrets from the inside. He is the most wanted, most dangerous, most capable Rick in the entire structure's history. And yet the Citadel keeps functioning, keeps having meetings and elections and economies and police forces, as if his presence and opposition does not structurally undermine their entire legitimacy. The Citadel's stated justification for existing is that Ricks need each other, that a community of the smartest beings in existence can protect itself better collectively than individually. But this is already a contradiction, because Ricks are defined by their radical independence. Their intelligence is supposed to make them self-sufficient. The fact that they joined a government contradicts the fundamental Rick philosophy. Our Rick points this out. In one of the Citadel episodes, he explicitly notes the irony of a bunch of anarchic geniuses forming a government to protect themselves from governments. It is an inherently absurd premise, and yet the Citadel exists. And it keeps drawing Ricks and Mortys back into its orbit even as they claim to reject it. The deeper paradox is dimensional. The Citadel in its operation draws Ricks from thousands of different dimensions to inhabit a single shared space. But these Ricks still have families and lives in their home dimensions. When a Rick spends years at the Citadel, what is happening to his Beth, his Morty, his Jerry? Are those families just waiting? Have they been abandoned? Have they been replaced by substitute Ricks? The show shows us working-class Ricks at the Citadel who appear to have fully relocated. Simple Rick, the most heartbreaking character in the Ricklantis Mix-Up episode, has given up adventuring entirely, and now works in a factory producing wafers that artificially replicate the emotional state of his one moment of genuine peace when he decided to stay with his family rather than go out exploring. He is essentially a captive whose happiness is being harvested for consumer products. But these working-class Ricks presumably had families in their home dimensions before they ended up at the Citadel. The show never follows that thread. The Mortys at the Citadel attend Morty School, which means they are living at the Citadel full-time, which means they have been removed from whatever families they had in their origin dimensions. The whole structure is a humanitarian disaster hiding inside a cool sci-fi concept. The Citadel is built on exploitation and abandonment, and the show knows this and uses it as sharp commentary on how collective institutions built around a shared identity can simultaneously be sources of community and sources of oppression. But the individual questions, where are the families of these relocated Ricks? What happened to the dimensions they came from? Who is caring for those Jerrys and Summers and Beths? Those questions float untouched and unanswered in the background. Section 14. The intro sequence mystery. The scene that is not from any episode. If you have watched enough Rick and Morty to be the kind of person who watches long videos about Rick and Morty mysteries, you have seen the intro sequence many hundreds of times. And if you have paid close attention, you know that there is a recurring element in the intro that has never been explained. The intro always ends the same way. After a montage of scenes from adventures that either are from the current season or are visual inventions for the sequence, the very last image before the title card is Rick and Morty in the spaceship, holding a tiny baby creature that looks something like a miniature Cthulhu, a small tentacled being, and being chased by its enormous, furious mother. This scene is not from any episode of the show. It has been in the intro from the very beginning. In every season that has aired, the intro uses clips from that season's episodes or thematically appropriate visual jokes, but this final scene is always the same, unchanged, without context, without explanation. This is deliberate. It has been acknowledged by the creators as deliberate. Dan Harmon and the writing staff have confirmed that this image represents an adventure Rick and Morty went on that has never been shown to the audience. It exists as a visual suggestion, a promise of something the show knows about but is not telling you. Here is a story. Here is a beginning and a context, but you do not get to know what happened in the middle or the end. Whether the show intends to ever actually do an episode that fills this in is unclear. The fact that it has remained unchanged across every season suggests it is more of a philosophical statement than a setup for a specific payoff. The intro is saying, there is always more than what you have seen. There are always adventures that did not make it into the episodes. The show's world is bigger than the show. But the fans, being fans, have spent years theorizing. The most persistent theory is that the little Cthulhu creature is somehow important to the show's mythology, perhaps connected to the opening frogs who chase Rick and Morty at the very beginning of every intro. Those frogs have also never appeared in an episode. The intro contains its own internal mythology that runs parallel to the show without ever intersecting with it. Section 15 Squanchy's Fate and the Loose Ends of the Wedding Squanchers. The Season 2 finale, The Wedding Squanchers, is one of the most emotionally devastating episodes the show produced in its early years. Birdperson and Tammy's wedding turns into a massacre when Tammy reveals herself as a Galactic Federation agent. Birdperson is shot, Rick barely escapes. Squanchy, Rick's small cat-like old friend, transforms into an enormous form and throws himself into battle against the Federation soldiers so the others can flee. And then we do not know what happened to him. For a long time, Squanchy's fate was completely unknown. He was either dead, captured, or somehow escaped, and the show simply did not say. He returned eventually in later seasons, alive and with his own story developments. But the gap between his disappearance at the wedding and his eventual reappearance was long enough that many fans had fully accepted he was dead. His return did not fully resolve the emotional questions his absence raised. Where was he? What happened to him in the years he was gone? How did he survive what appeared to be a hopeless situation? The show did not really elaborate. He was back. He was fine, more or less. The gap was acknowledged but not filled. This is a pattern the show returns to frequently. Characters disappear into situations that should be catastrophic and then turn up later without a full accounting of what the interval contained. Birdperson himself is the most extreme example. He is shot at his wedding, transformed into the cyborg Phoenix person by the Galactic Federation, used as a weapon against Rick in Season 4, and then gradually recovered his own identity over the following seasons through Rick's efforts to restore him. His experience as Phoenix person, what it felt like to be aware inside a hijacked body, what he remembered and what was suppressed, the show has gestured at these questions without fully exploring them. These are not oversights. The show is too carefully constructed for that. They are choices. The choice to leave spaces, to not fill in everything, to trust the audience to sit with the gaps and find them meaningful rather than frustrating. The mystery of what happened to Bird Person's inner life during his time as Phoenix Person is one the show may never fully answer. It lives in the same category as the talking cat and the intro sequence creature and Diane's erasure. Things the show knows about and has chosen, for now, to hold back. Section 16, the Rick and Morty time loop theory. Is the whole show circular? This is the wildest and most expansive theory that the show's fandom has produced, and it is one that the show itself has done nothing to definitively disprove, which is, given the show's tendencies, almost certainly intentional. The theory goes like this. We know, confirmed by the show, that there is a bootstrap paradox at the center of Morty's existence. He exists because of something he did before he was born. We know that Rick has traveled extensively through time in various ways, including the time crystals that appear as a recurring detail across the show. We know that the central finite curve was built specifically to limit the parameters of dimensional travel in ways that maintain Rick's dominance. We know that Evil Morty, potentially, may be an older version of our Morty from a future timeline. The theory proposes that the entire show is a time loop, that the story of Rick and Morty has happened before, possibly many times, and that various characters are aware of this to varying degrees. Rick's extreme nihilism, his certainty that nothing ultimately matters, could be the fatalism of a man who has lived through the loop and knows how it ends. Evil Morty's precocious certainty, his ability to anticipate Rick's moves across seasons, could be the advantage of someone who has access to information from a future that has not happened yet. Under this theory, the intro sequence scene with the tiny Cthulhu creature is not just an unexplained adventure. It is either the beginning or the end of the loop, a moment that the show is working toward or working away from. The frogs at the beginning of the intro and the creature chase at the end are the two endpoints of a narrative circle. There is no confirmation of this theory in the show's actual text, but the show has also, notably, never produced a moment that definitively contradicts it. Every piece of information revealed about Rick's history could be interpreted through the lens of a character who has been through this before. Every choice Rick makes that seems unnecessarily destructive or self-defeating could be explained by a man doing what he knows needs to happen. The evidence people marshal for the time loop theory is scattered across the show in ways that look either like deliberate foreshadowing or like the natural result of a well-constructed mythology that has enough internal consistency to look like planning from a distance. People point to the fact that Rick seems to know things he should not know. He occasionally reacts to events before they fully unfold. He sometimes makes choices that seem strange in the moment but turn out to be exactly right in retrospect. The most charitable interpretation is that Rick is simply so intelligent that his ability to model probability is effectively precognitive. He runs the numbers faster than anyone else and arrives at accurate predictions. But there are moments where his knowledge seems to exceed even that. Moments where he seems to know not just what is likely, but what is specifically going to happen. Then there are the crystals. The show references xanthanite, also called time crystals, multiple times across different seasons. They appear in different contexts. Rick uses them to access alternate timelines. They appear as pink substances that crystallize and alter the experience of time for whoever comes into contact with them. The death crystals in the Season 4 premiere, which allow the user to see possible futures, are related to this general category of temporal manipulation. The substance that transforms Jessica into a time god is described in terms that connect it to the same class of materials. Rick officially hates time travel. He officially considers it a philosophical mess and a narrative dead end. And yet he owns time crystals and has used temporal technology on multiple occasions when it suited him. The box on the shelf labeled time travel stuff is not a box of things he threw away. It is a box of things he is not currently using but has kept. The decision to keep them is its own statement. The time loop theory is not likely to be the literal explanation for how Rick and Morty works. The creators have been fairly clear that they are committed to a kind of ongoing, evolving, not fully planned storytelling where threads get picked up and dropped and picked up again, rather than toward a single grand unified theory of everything. But the fact that you can hold it up against the show and see it fit, with more elegance than it has any right to, suggests that the show's internal logic is so consistent that even its unplanned coincidences start to look like a pattern. Section 16b, the Galactic Federation, Supernova, and the Vindicators, villains left hanging. There are antagonists and antagonist-adjacent characters in Rick and Morty who were set up with apparent significance and then left in states of unresolved tension that the show has not returned to, and some of them represent genuinely significant loose ends. The Galactic Federation is the most prominent of these. For the first 2 seasons of the show, the Galactic Federation serves as one of the primary antagonistic forces in Rick's life. They want him. They want his portal gun. They want the interdimensional travel technology that only Rick has independently developed. They are willing to arrest his family, bribe informants, and deploy substantial resources to bring him in. At the end of Season 2, they succeed. They capture Rick and take over Earth, transforming it into an occupation zone with alien administrators and a new social order in which humans are slotted into roles based on the needs of the Federation bureaucracy. Rick dismantles all of this in the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, in one of the show's most spectacular single-episode reversals. He allows himself to be interrogated, uses the interrogation as cover for a virus upload, collapses the Federation's economy by changing the exchange rate of their currency to 0, and brings the whole imperial structure down in an afternoon. The Federation, which had been presented as a looming threat for 2 seasons, is destroyed before the Season 3 premiere's first commercial break. But here is the mystery. Destroyed is a strong word for what happened. The Federation's economy collapsed. Its hold on Earth was broken. Its administrative infrastructure was disrupted. But the Federation as an entity, as a collection of alien species and political structures, did not cease to exist. Its leadership presumably survived somewhere. Its military presumably retained ships and resources. The specific bureaucrats and agents who were invested in capturing Rick did not all die in a stock market crash. The show moved on as if the Federation was dealt with. And in the context of the story's priorities after Season 3, it was. Bigger things came up. Rick Prime emerged as a focus. Evil Morty resurfaced. The central finite curve became the central lore development. The Federation simply stopped being narratively important and was quietly set aside. But they are still out there. The galaxy-spanning government that was systematically disassembled by one man in one afternoon still exists in some form. Its intelligence files on Rick still exist. Its grievances still exist. The specific agents who dedicated careers to capturing the universe's most wanted scientist presumably still exist and are still, at minimum, professionally interested in finding him. Supernova is an even cleaner example of a villain left meaningfully unresolved. She appears in the Season 3 episode about the Vindicators, a superhero team that Rick and Morty are called in to assist. The episode reveals that the Vindicators, who Rick has always resented for their self-congratulatory heroism, are deeply flawed in the specific way that hypocrites are flawed. They project righteousness while behaving badly in private. Supernova is the survivor of the episode. By its end, through circumstances involving trap-based mortality and revealed affairs, and Rick's deliberately designed escape room of ethical tests, most of the Vindicators are dead, and Supernova, who has her own history of deeply problematic behavior, including a sexual relationship with a teammate that contributed to another teammate's psychological deterioration, escapes. She escapes after making it very clear that she intends to come back for Rick. She has not come back. She has not appeared in any subsequent episode. A character who was established as having both motivation and capability to cause serious problems for Rick has simply not materialized as a threat. This could be a forgotten thread. It could also be a seed that has been sitting in the soil for several seasons waiting for the right moment, when all the other dramatic priorities that have consumed the last several seasons have been addressed enough to make room for a character who is angry at Rick specifically for different reasons than any of the show's other antagonists. What makes Supernova interesting as a potential future antagonist is that her grievance against Rick is not existential. It is not about the multiverse or revenge for dimensional manipulation or the politics of the Citadel. It is personal. She watched people she knew die in situations Rick engineered, even if the engineering was intended to be educational rather than lethal. Her anger is the anger of someone who had colleagues and watched them get used as props in Rick's game. That is a different emotional register than the show's other antagonist relationships, and it is one that the show might find useful in seasons where it wants to tell smaller, more character-focused stories between the large-scale mythology episodes. Section 17: What Season 9 Needs to Answer. The mysteries still open. The 9th season of Rick and Morty premiered on the 24th of May, 2026, and at the time of this script's writing, it is currently airing. What the show has set up going into this season is a landscape of mysteries that are potentially more interlinked than any previous season has had to manage simultaneously. There is Mr. Poopy Butthole, confirmed by Season 8's finale to have atomic vibrations that do not match any known dimensional signature in the scientist's database, now being held in a facility by people who do not know what he is or where he came from. His wife Amy suspects him of being an imposter, which he is, but the deeper question of what he actually is rather than simply where this version of him came from has been reopened with fresh urgency. There is Evil Morty, somewhere in the outer multiverse, in possession of the Omega device plans. He has said he wants to be left alone. He has also demonstrated across multiple seasons that his stated desires and his actual plans do not always match. He is the only character confirmed to be operating in the space beyond the central finite curve. He has intelligence comparable to Rick's. He has shown the capacity for extraordinary patience. The Season 8 build-up suggests his next appearance will be significant. There is the question of what Rick does now. Season 7 ended with Rick having killed Rick Prime, the object of decades of obsessive revenge, and then finding himself on the other side of it with nothing waiting for him. The grief that organized his entire life is still there, but the mission that gave it direction is gone. Who is Rick Sanchez when he is not hunting anyone? What does he want? What does he build when he is not building toward revenge? There is Space Beth and Home Beth, whose double existence the show has not resolved and whose individual journeys have led them to different places emotionally. The Season 8 finale's focus on Beth's relationship with her parents, including the AI memory Diane that Rick constructed, suggests this arc has more to offer. There are the precogs introduced in Season 8's 9th episode, 3 alien beings with the ability to perceive the future, whom Rick threw into his garbage dimension when they annoyed him. 3 beings who can see the future and who now have every reason to want revenge on the man who discarded them is an antagonist setup with enormous potential. There is Jessica the Time God, still unresolved, still barely referenced since the moment the transformation occurred. There is the question of the outer multiverse and what exists in it. The curve is largely repaired from Evil Morty's breach, but the breach happened. The knowledge that it is possible to leave Rick's curated section of reality has changed what that section means. Rick now knows his dominance is not universal. He knows there are parts of existence where he is not automatically the most powerful person in the room. That knowledge has to change something about how he operates. The Season 9 premiere, which aired on the 24th of May 2026, titled Something That Begins the Show's New Chapter with Characteristic Chaos, has already begun to pull on some of these threads. Without spoiling specific developments for anyone who has not caught up, the general shape of the season seems oriented around the aftermath of Season 8's emotional finale, which closed Rick's relationship with Memory Diane in a way that was both devastating and cathartic. Rick let go of the AI reconstruction of his wife that he had been using to haunt himself, allowed Memory Rick, the persona he had constructed to house that grief, to find peace, and emerged from the experience in a state that the show seems interested in exploring. What does Rick Sanchez want now that the thing he wanted most for decades, revenge on Rick Prime, has been achieved and put away? This is, in a fundamental way, the same question the show has been building towards since its first episode, without ever being willing to stay with it for long. Rick as a character is most legible, most comprehensible, most functional as a narrative construct when he is running from something, running from grief, running from vulnerability, running from relationships that require him to be present and open and honest. Every adventure has been, on some level, an exercise in avoidance. Even the revenge quest was avoidance. It was a way to make the grief into a mission so that he did not have to simply sit in it. Now the mission is done. And the grief is still there, presumably, though the AI he built to channel it has been released. And what Rick does when he cannot run is the question the show has finally, after 9 seasons, positioned itself to answer. And then, underlying all of it, there is the question that the show has been building towards since its very first season, without ever asking it directly. What does it mean to choose to love someone who keeps demonstrating they cannot be trusted to stay? What does it mean to be Morty, who has dedicated his formative years to a relationship with a man who has been using him as a sidekick and a shield? The Season 7 finale, Fear No Mort, put Morty in a situation that forced him to confront what he was most afraid of. And what he discovered was that his deepest fear was spending his life serving Rick, only to be eventually discarded when Rick deemed him no longer useful. That is the fear at the center of Morty Smith. Not death, not pain, not aliens or monsters. The fear that the relationship he has organized his entire sense of self around is one-sided, that he matters to Rick functionally but not fundamentally. Whether the show has the courage to actually resolve that in a satisfying way, rather than simply circling around it, as it has for 8 seasons, is perhaps the most important unsolved mystery of all. Section 17B, Unity and the loneliest relationship in the multiverse. There is one relationship in Rick's life that is not about family, not about revenge, not about the transactional friendships of people who are useful to each other. There is one relationship that looked, briefly, like genuine love in the most uncomplicated sense, and it ended in one of the quietest and most devastating episodes the show has ever produced. Unity is a hive mind, a consciousness that has spread across an entire planet, inhabiting every single person on that world simultaneously, coordinating their bodies and decisions while maintaining something like a singular self at the center of it all. Unity and Rick have a history. They were close, once, before the events of the show. They drifted apart, and in a Season 2 episode called Autoerotic Assimilation, Unity reconnects with Rick, and what follows is an episode that is simultaneously one of the funniest and most melancholy in the show's run. Rick and Unity work, as a couple, in the specific way that two people work when each of them has found the one person in the universe who matches their particular flavor of chaos and self-destruction. Rick provides Unity with novelty, with external perspective, with a partner who is genuinely her intellectual and creative equal. Unity provides Rick with something almost no other being can offer him, a partner who is, literally, everywhere at once, whose love surrounds him completely, whose presence fills a space rather than occupying a position in it. But Rick is toxic in the specific way that he is always toxic. His presence pushes Unity toward behaviors she is trying to move past. His influence, even unintentionally, encourages the kind of impulsive, consequence-ignoring hedonism that Rick embodies, and that Unity, who is responsible for an entire planet's worth of people, cannot safely indulge. He is not malicious about this. He is not intentionally destructive. He is simply himself, and himself is not compatible with Unity's responsibilities. Unity leaves. She sends Rick a message, which he finds when he sobers up, explaining why. It is gentle and specific and devastatingly honest about why what they have cannot work. Not because she does not care, but because caring is not always enough to make something functional or safe. She tells him she needs to work on herself, separately, away from his influence. Rick, alone in his garage, begins to prepare what appears to be a suicide device. The show cuts away before showing the outcome. He is alive in subsequent episodes. The implication, held carefully, is that something stopped him, or that he could not go through with it, or that he tried and it did not work, or that the device was not actually what it appeared to be. The show never says. It just shows you the moment and trusts you to understand what you are looking at. This is the show at its most adult and its most honest. Not about science fiction or multiverses or paradoxes. About a person who found something that worked, who could not stay in it, and who was left with the silence afterward. The mystery around Unity is whether she is still out there, whether the planet she inhabits still exists or has been consumed by the political instability that her impulsive behavior during Rick's visit created, and whether Rick and Unity will ever encounter each other again in a way the show has time to explore properly. Their relationship was resolved in the most emotionally authentic way possible for that episode, but the door was not locked. Unity is somewhere in the multiverse, managing a planet's worth of consciousnesses, missing Rick in whatever way a hive mind misses someone it cannot go back to. And Rick is somewhere, building things, drinking, moving forward, carrying the memory of a relationship that worked until it did not. Section 18, the small mysteries that live in the background. There are smaller mysteries the show has generated without resolving, and some of them have been living in the fans' consciousness long enough that they feel like old furniture in a familiar room. Things you have stopped noticing because they have been there so long, but which are still unaccounted for. Diane Sanchez's mother. Rick's wife, the woman Rick loved and lost to Rick Prime's bombing, existed before she met Rick. She had parents. She had a history. The show has never given the audience a glimpse of Diane beyond her role in Rick's grief. Even the scenes of her that exist in the show are from Rick's perspective, glimpses of memory rather than a complete portrait. We know she was warm and loved Rick, and that their relationship felt ordinary in the good way, domestic and real. But who was she beyond being Rick's loss? The show has room to answer this if it wants to, but no indication it plans to. The Atlantis Adventure. There is an episode in Season 2, the Rick-Lantis Mix-Up, in which Rick and Morty are supposed to go to Atlantis, which Morty has been excited about, and instead get diverted to the Citadel. The Atlantis Adventure happens off-screen. We hear that it involved mermaids. Rick and Morty both seem to have enjoyed it. That is everything we know. The show has used Atlantis as a recurring enticement, something the characters reference but that the audience has never gotten to see. Whether this is a setup for a future episode or simply a running joke that will never be paid off is unclear. Kyle. The show references a character called Kyle multiple times as a previous Rick sidekick, someone who occupied the Morty-adjacent role before Morty did. Details are scarce. Mr. Nimbus mentions Kyle. Rick's contingency wheel for Morty replacements has a section labeled Kyle 2. There are exactly enough references to make Kyle feel like part of Rick's history without telling us anything about who he was or what happened to him. Did Rick discard him? Did Kyle choose to leave? Is Kyle still alive somewhere in the multiverse? Beth's mother. The show knows, and we know, that Beth Sanchez had a mother. Rick had a wife before Diane was introduced as that wife, and the ambiguity about who the woman was in Rick's life remained for several seasons before Diane was confirmed. But even after Diane was confirmed, Beth's mother as a person, as a woman with her own history and personality, has remained almost entirely absent. Given how central the father-daughter dynamic between Rick and Beth is to the show, the absence of Beth's mother as a developed character is a gap that would seem natural to fill at some point. The Jerry Daycare Asteroid. In a Season 2 episode, Rick mentions that the Jerry Bury, the daycare where Rick drops Jerry when he does not want to deal with him, exists on what he describes as a cross-temporal asteroid, meaning it exists in all dimensions simultaneously. This makes it possibly the most strategically valuable location in the entire multiverse. A place that is physically accessible from every dimension at the same time is, from a military or governmental perspective, extraordinarily valuable. The Galactic Federation has never, as far as the show has shown us, attempted to take control of this location. The Council of Ricks never weaponized it. It is just sitting there, dimension-spanning, enormously powerful, full of depressed Jerrys. The Plumbus. The show introduced the Plumbus as an in-universe ordinary household object that everyone apparently knows about, but whose actual function has never been explained. Interdimensional cable segments reveal that there is a whole manufacturing process for Plumbuses, involving creatures called Dinglebops. That was explained in loving detail while still leaving the actual purpose of the finished object completely unclear. The Plumbus is there. Everyone has one. Nobody will tell you what it does. There is another dimension to the Citadel paradoxes that the show explores beautifully in the Rick-Lantis Mix-Up episode, which is about class and inequality, and the ways that even a community of supposedly equal geniuses stratifies itself into haves and have-nots almost immediately. The Ricks at the Citadel are not all equal. There are wealthy Ricks who run businesses and sit on councils and live comfortably in the upper echelons of the Citadel's hierarchy. There are poor Ricks who work in factories, who make wafers that harvest simple Ricks' emotional happiness as a product, who live in whatever the Citadel's equivalent of neighborhoods with cheaper rent is. The show is making a point that intelligence, even extraordinary intelligence, does not produce equality when you organize it into a society. The same dynamics that produce inequality in human societies produce inequality in Rick society, because intelligence is not the only variable that determines outcome. Access to resources, luck, timing, the specific dimension you came from, and what advantages or disadvantages that origin gave you, all of these interact with intelligence to produce the range of outcomes we see at the Citadel. The most heartbreaking Rick at the Citadel is Simple Rick. Not the most sympathetic and not the most interesting, but the most heartbreaking. He is a Rick who chose at some pivotal moment in his life to stay with his family instead of going on adventures. He chose the small, quiet, domestic version of his existence. And for that choice, he has been placed in a factory where his one moment of genuine happiness, that single moment of decision, is being harvested over and over as a consumer product. His contentment is being extracted from him continuously. He is, in a very precise sense, being exploited for having made the emotionally correct choice. The mystery the Citadel leaves behind is not just structural but moral. If the institution that was built by the smartest beings in existence produces this, if the best those minds could collectively build is a class-stratified exploitation machine that harvests the emotional happiness of the most human among them, what does that say about what intelligence actually produces when it organizes itself without love or care or genuine connection? Rick C. 137, watching this from the outside, having left the Citadel before it completed its descent into this, is looking at what he helped create, and the show never fully reckons with that. He is allowed to be disgusted by the Citadel and what it became without fully acknowledging that he was part of what made it possible. The mystery of what Rick actually feels about the Citadel, beneath the contempt and the pose of independence, is another of those interior spaces the show invites you into without ever fully illuminating. These smaller mysteries cluster around the larger ones like satellites. They do not change the shape of the show's mythology, but they add texture. They make the world feel bigger than the story being told, which is exactly the effect the creators are going for. A universe that only contains exactly what the show has described is a small universe. A universe with Plumbuses and Atlantis adventures and Kyles and cross-temporal asteroid daycares that the show has not gotten around to exploring yet is enormous and alive and full of possibilities. Section 19: Why the show chooses not to answer everything and why that is the right call. After going through all of this, all the mysteries and the paradoxes and the dangling threads and the questions without answers, it is worth stepping back and asking why. Why does a show as carefully constructed and written by people who clearly care as Rick and Morty make the deliberate choice to leave so many things unanswered? Dan Harmon, who has been public and thoughtful about his creative philosophy across many interviews, has spoken about this in the context of both Rick and Morty and his earlier work on Community. There is a principle in storytelling that you might call the shark principle, named after the problems that plagued the production of Jaws and the way that not seeing the shark turned out to make the film more frightening than any version of actually seeing it. The thing you imagine is more vivid than the thing you are shown, because your imagination is calibrated to your own personal depth of horror. What frightens you is not the same as what frightens me. So if the show shows us the cat's secret, it shows one answer. If the show hides it, every viewer fills in their own answer, and everyone's answer is uniquely suited to be maximally disturbing to exactly them. This applies not to horror, it applies to mystery in general. The Jessica Time God story, unexplored, exists in a quantum state of possibility in the viewer's mind. She could become anything. She could turn out to be a crucial resource in the fight against whatever comes next for Rick. She could turn out to be the person who finally tells Morty the truth about his relationship with Rick in a way that changes everything. She could turn out to be something completely unexpected, something the writers have not thought of yet, something a viewer will suggest in a comment that will actually influence where the story goes. As long as her arc is open, all of that is still possible. The moment it is resolved, most of those possibilities collapse. The story becomes one thing, the mystery becomes a fact. And facts, while satisfying in the short term, do not generate the same kind of ongoing engagement that a question does. Rick and Morty is a show that runs on engagement. It runs on the community of people who care about it deeply enough to argue about it, to build theories, to go back and rewatch old episodes looking for clues, to make video essays about its mysteries at 2 a.m. in a quiet room. Every unresolved mystery is fuel for that community. Every question without an answer is an invitation to participate in the story, rather than simply receive it. There is a version of this that is a cynical calculation. Keep people guessing to keep them watching. But the show's best mysteries do not feel cynical. They feel like care. The mystery of what Rick saw in the talking cat's mind is not withheld to manipulate the audience. It is withheld because the writers understood that the withholding is the point of the scene. The mystery of Diane's erasure was not held for 7 seasons out of laziness. It was held until the show had built the emotional infrastructure necessary for it to land with its full weight. The mysteries are not failures to resolve. They are a specific kind of storytelling choice that trusts the audience to meet the show halfway, to hold the questions and live with them and let them mean something over time. Closing an infinite multiverse contains infinite unanswered questions. Here is where we land. Not at an answer, but at a shape. We have been in here for a long time now. Long enough, maybe, for the room to have gotten a little darker outside. Long enough for this to have stopped being background noise and started being something you followed even as you rested. So let us close with something that feels right for the end of something this long. Rick and Morty is a show about a genius who built a wall around infinity so he would always be the smartest person inside it. It is about a boy who exists because of something he did before he was born. It is about an alternate version of that boy who decided to tear the wall down. It is about a small yellow creature whose smile is both completely genuine and completely unexplained. It is about a cat who told Rick a secret so terrible that Rick briefly considered not being alive anymore, and then erased everyone else's memory of it and let the cat go. It is about all the moments the show has shown you, and it is equally about all the moments the show has mentioned without showing you. The Atlantis adventure, Kyle, the baby Cthulhu scene in the intro, the inside of the cat's mind, the other side of the central finite curve. It is a show that was built to leave you with questions at 2 in the morning. And those questions are not a frustration. They are a gift. They are the show's way of saying that the universe is larger than any story can contain. And the best any story can do is point toward the edges of what it knows and say, out there, beyond what we have shown you, is more. The mysteries are real. The paradoxes are real. The questions are going to keep generating new questions as the show continues through its confirmed run into season 12 and possibly beyond. And somewhere in all of that, there is a character who has been watching the show on television, who has always been friendly to the Smiths, whose atomic vibrations do not match anything in any database, who says ooh wee and means it, and whose true nature is the most open question the show has ever left standing. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you made it this far, through all the theories and the lore and the paradoxes and the mysteries, drop something in the comments. Tell us which mystery bothers you the most. The one that keeps you up. Tell us your theory about the cat. Tell us where you think Evil Morty is right now. What he is doing out there in the part of the multiverse where Rick is just a regular guy. And if this was something you listened to while drifting off, while your eyes got heavy somewhere around section 8 or 11, we hope the questions followed you into sleep in the best possible way. The kind of sleep full of strange imagery and half-formed theories, and the feeling that somewhere in an infinite multiverse, a tiny portal is opening, and something interesting is about to step through it. If these long, slow explorations of the things you love are something you want more of, a subscription costs you nothing and helps us keep making them. Sleep well. The multiverse will be here when you wake up. So will the questions.